The waves crashed against the metallic hulls of landing craft as they cut through the dark waters of the English Channel in the pre-dawn hours of June 6, 1944. Private James Mackenzie pressed his back against the cold steel wall of the Higgins boat, his knuckles white as he gripped his rifle. Around him, 30 other soldiers sat in grim silence, their faces painted with camouflage and determination. The boat pitched and rolled violently, causing several men to retch into their helmets. 10 minutes! Shouted the coxswain over the roar of the engine and crashing waves. Mackenzie's stomach lurched, though whether from seasickness or terror, he couldn't tell. This was it, Operation Overlord, the largest amphibious invasion in human history. For months, the Allied forces had prepared for this moment, training relentlessly in the English countryside, studying reconnaissance photographs and memorizing the beaches of Nazi-occupied France. General Dwight David Eisenhower had made the fateful decision just hours earlier, despite marginal weather conditions that had already delayed the invasion by 24 hours. The Supreme Allied commander knew that another postponement could push the operation back weeks, giving the Germans more time to strengthen their Atlantic Wall defenses. In his pocket, Eisenhower carried a handwritten note accepting full responsibility, should the invasion fail. As the first gray light of dawn began to pierce the overcast sky, the massive armada became visible. Over 5,000 ships stretched across the horizon. Battleships, destroyers, cruisers, transport vessels, and landing craft. It was the largest naval fleet ever assembled, carrying 160,000 Allied troops toward 5 beaches codenamed Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. The sight was both magnificent and terrifying. Lieutenant Colonel James Earl Rudder, commanding the 2nd Ranger Battalion, studied the imposing cliffs of Point du Hoc through his binoculars. His men had perhaps the most dangerous mission of all, scaling the 100-foot cliffs under enemy fire to destroy German artillery positions that could devastate the invasion fleet. Rudder knew that failure would mean disaster for thousands of American soldiers landing at nearby Omaha Beach. The pre-invasion bombardment had begun hours earlier. Allied bombers had pounded the German defenses throughout the night, while naval guns now joined the devastating barrage. The thunder of explosions rolled across the water like an endless storm. Yet despite this massive firepower, intelligence reports suggested that many German positions remained intact, protected by reinforced concrete bunkers and underground tunnels. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, had spent months fortifying the French coast. His Atlantic Wall consisted of massive concrete bunkers, steel obstacles on the beaches, underwater mines, and interlocking fields of fire designed to turn any landing into a killing field. Fortunately for the Allies, Rommel was away in Germany, celebrating his wife's birthday and meeting with Hitler about reinforcing the coastal defenses. According to historical accounts documented in D-Day, the Battle for Normandy by Anthony Beevor, the German High Command remained divided about where the main Allied assault would come. As Mackenzie's landing craft approached Omaha Beach, he could see the German fortifications clearly now. Concrete bunkers dotted the bluffs overlooking the sand, their dark gun ports like malevolent eyes watching the approaching fleet. Barbed wire snaked across the beach, and steel obstacles jutted from the sand like deadly teeth. The young private from Minnesota had never imagined anything so intimidating. The coxswain's voice cut through the engine noise. 30 seconds! Lock and load! The metallic sound of rifle bolts echoed through the cramped compartment as soldiers prepared their weapons. Mackenzie checked his ammunition one final time, said a silent prayer, and steeled himself for what lay ahead. The liberation of Western Europe was about to begin with blood and sacrifice on the beaches of Normandy. The ramp of the landing craft crashed down into the surf with a metallic clang that seemed to signal the opening of hell itself. Machine gun fire immediately erupted from the German positions, the deadly chatter mixing with the screams of wounded men and the crash of artillery shells. Private Mackenzie leap into chest-deep water that ran red with blood within seconds of the first soldiers reaching the beach. "Move! Move! Move!" screamed Sergeant Thompson as bullets whined overhead like angry hornets. Men fell all around Mackenzie, some silently disappearing beneath the waves, others crying out for medics who couldn't reach them through the withering fire. The beach that military planners had designated as Omaha stretched before them like a nightmare. 400 yards of killing ground swept by interlocking machine gun fire from the bluffs above. Captain John Miller of the 2nd Ranger Battalion crawled behind a steel beach obstacle, his uniform soaked with seawater and the blood of his men. Half his company was already dead or wounded, cut down in the first minutes of the assault. The German positions seemed impregnable, their concrete bunkers shrugging off direct hits from naval gunfire. Miller grabbed his radio and tried desperately to call for support, but the equipment had been damaged by shrapnel. The disaster at Omaha Beach was unfolding exactly as Field Marshal Rommel had planned. The German 352nd Infantry Division, commanded by Colonel Dietrich Kreis, had turned the beach into a death trap. Their MG-42 machine guns fired down from commanding positions, while mortar crews dropped shells with deadly precision among the struggling American forces. The beach became littered with the bodies of soldiers who would never see home again. Brigadier General Norman Cota, Assistant Division Commander of the 29th Infantry Division, waded ashore through the carnage with remarkable calm. Seeing his men pinned down and demoralized, he moved among them despite the intense fire. "Rangers, lead the way!" he shouted to a group of soldiers huddled behind obstacles. His courage was infectious, inspiring small groups to begin moving inland despite the seemingly impossible odds. The naval bombardment resumed with renewed intensity as commanders realized the desperate situation on the beach. The USS Texas, USS Arkansas, and other battleships moved dangerously close to shore, their massive guns pounding the German positions with 14-inch shells. Destroyers raced toward the beach at flank speed, their crews manning deck guns to provide direct fire support for the infantry. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Canham of the 116th Infantry Regiment had been wounded twice, but continued, leading his men forward. Blood streamed down his face from shrapnel wounds, yet he pressed on, knowing that staying on the beach meant certain death. "They're murdering us here," he radioed to headquarters. "Get us off this beach!" But there was nowhere to go except forward, up the heavily defended bluffs. Private Mackenzie found himself part of a small group that had managed to cross the beach and reach the base of the cliffs. Behind them, the sand was carpeted with American, dead and wounded. Medics worked frantically to save lives while under fire, their Red Cross armbands providing no protection from German snipers. The young Minnesotan had seen things in the past hour that would haunt him forever. The German defenders fought with desperate efficiency, knowing that their positions were key to throwing back the invasion. Machine gunners in resistance point. 72 kept up a continuous fire, their weapons so hot that crews had to pour water on the barrels to prevent them from warping. Artillery observers in concrete observation posts directed devastating fire onto the beach, turning landing craft into floating coffins. As the morning progressed, small groups of American soldiers began finding gaps in the German defenses. Bangalore. Torpedoes blasted through wire obstacles, and brave men crawled up draws and gullies under intense fire. The tide was literally turning. Both the ocean tide that began to cover the steel obstacles and the tide of battle as American determination gradually overcame German firepower. Colonel George Taylor of the 16th Infantry Regiment summed up the situation perfectly as he moved among his men. "Two kinds of people are staying on this beach, the dead and those who are going to die. Now let's get the hell out of here." His words galvanized soldiers who had been paralyzed by the intensity of German fire. Slowly, painfully, the American forces began their climb up the bloody bluffs of Omaha Beach. While the carnage unfolded at Omaha Beach, Lieutenant Colonel James Earl Rudder's Rangers faced an equally daunting task 3 miles to the west. Point du Hoc rose from the sea like a medieval fortress, its limestone cliffs towering 100 feet above the rocky shoreline. German artillery positions atop the promontory could destroy the entire invasion fleet if left intact, making the Rangers' mission absolutely critical to the success of Operation Overlord. The Ranger landing craft approached the base of the cliffs, under a hail of machine gun fire and hand grenades dropped from above. Private First Class Jack Kuhn pressed himself against the rocky wall as German potato masher grenades exploded around his position. The Rangers had trained extensively in England and Scotland for this moment, but nothing had prepared them for the reality of scaling vertical cliffs while under enemy fire. Sergeant Leonard Lommel fired the first rocket-propelled grappling hook, watching as the rope ladder uncoiled and caught on the cliff face above. Within seconds, German soldiers were cutting the ropes and pushing the ladders away from the cliff. "Keep firing them hooks!" shouted Rudder over the din of battle. The Rangers had brought extra equipment for exactly this situation. They knew the Germans would try to sabotage their climbing aids. The naval fire support was crucial to their survival. The destroyer USS Satterlee moved so close to shore that her keel scraped the rocky bottom, her 5-inch guns hammering German positions with devastating accuracy. Gun crews aboard the ship could see individual Rangers climbing the cliff face, and adjusted their fire to provide maximum support without hitting their own men. Private Carl Wiest reached the top of the cliff after a harrowing 10-minute climb, bullets whining past his helmet throughout the ascent. What he found at the summit shocked him. The massive German guns that had been the target of their mission were wooden decoys. The real artillery pieces had been moved inland weeks earlier, hidden in Norman apple orchards where they remained a deadly threat to the invasion beaches. The German defenders of Point du Hoc belonged to the elite 2nd Parachute Regiment, hardened veterans who had fought in Crete and the Eastern Front. Hauptmann Friedrich Ocker commanded the position with typical German efficiency, having positioned machine gun nests and sniper positions to cover every possible approach. His men fought with the desperation of soldiers who knew that defeat meant the beginning of Germany's end. Despite discovering that the main guns were decoys, Rudder's Rangers had to hold their position to prevent German counterattacks against Omaha Beach. They established a defensive perimeter using shell craters and captured German trenches, knowing that enemy reinforcements would soon arrive. The original force of 225 Rangers had been reduced to 90 effective fighters in the first hour of combat. Sergeant Lommel and Staff Sergeant Jack Kuhn set out on patrol to locate the real German artillery positions. Moving carefully through the Norman countryside, they discovered the actual guns camouflaged in an orchard 1 kilometer inland. The massive 155mm howitzers were positioned to fire on Utah and Omaha beaches, loaded and ready to devastate the landing forces. Military historians at the United States Army Center of Military History have documented that the Rangers' discovery and destruction of these guns was pivotal to the invasion's success. Working quickly and quietly, Lommel and Kuhn used thermite grenades to destroy the guns' mechanisms, rendering them useless. They also cut telephone wires connecting the position to German command posts, disrupting communications at a crucial moment. Their actions potentially saved thousands of American lives on the beaches below. The German counterattack came at midday, as elements of the 914th Grenadier Regiment moved to retake Point du Hoc. The Rangers fought desperately from their crater positions, their ammunition running dangerously low. Many of the wounded continued fighting despite serious injuries, knowing that capture might mean execution for participating in what the Germans considered a terror raid. Radio communication with the fleet remained sporadic due to damaged equipment and German jamming efforts. Lieutenant Colonel Rudder tried repeatedly to call for naval gunfire support, watching as German infantry advanced across the shell-torn landscape. The Rangers held their positions through sheer determination and superior marksmanship, but everyone knew they couldn't last much longer without reinforcement. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the blood-soaked promontory, the surviving Rangers continued their desperate defense. They had accomplished their primary mission. The German guns would never fire on the invasion beaches. Now they faced the prospect of dying in the positions they had fought so hard to capture, surrounded by enemies and running low on ammunition, water, and hope. As the Rangers fought their desperate battle atop Point du Hoc, the situation at Omaha Beach began to shift dramatically. Small groups of American soldiers had found weaknesses in the German defenses, exploiting draws and gullies to work their way up the bluffs. The breakthrough came when Brigadier General Norman Cota personally led a mixed group of Rangers and infantry through a gap in the wire near the Vierville Draw. Captain Taylor Fellers of the 5th Ranger Battalion had been wounded twice, but continued pushing forward with his men. They had discovered that the German positions, while deadly when approached frontally, had vulnerable flanks that could be exploited by determined infantry. Using hand grenades and Bangalore torpedoes, small teams began systematically clearing bunkers that had dominated the beach for hours. The German defense of Omaha Beach began to crumble as American forces infiltrated their positions. Colonel Dietrich Kreis, commanding the 352nd Infantry Division, watched helplessly from his command post as his carefully prepared killing field was overrun. Radio reports from his forward positions painted a grim picture. The Americans were not retreating as planned, but were instead fighting with a ferocity that exceeded German expectations. Private Mackenzie found himself part of a squad that had reached the top of the bluff overlooking the beach. Looking back, he could see the continuing carnage below. Landing craft still approaching through the surf, medics treating wounded soldiers, and engineers working to clear obstacles. But now American forces controlled the high ground, and the character of the battle was changing rapidly. The success at Omaha Beach was mirrored by developments on the other invasion beaches. At Utah Beach, the 4th Infantry Division under Major General Raymond Barton had landed with relatively light casualties due to strong currents that carried them away from the most heavily defended areas. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt, Jr., son of the former president, had insisted on accompanying the first wave despite his age and poor health. British and Canadian forces were making excellent progress on Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches. The 3rd Canadian Infantry Division, commanded by Major General Rod Keller, had pushed inland from Juno Beach and was advancing toward the city of Caen. Their success demonstrated that the German Atlantic Wall, while formidable, could be breached by determined Allied forces with proper support. The German response to the invasion was hampered by confusion at the highest levels of command. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, overall commander of German forces in Western Europe, was convinced that the Normandy landings were a diversion for the main assault at Pas-de-Calais. This strategic deception, carefully cultivated by Allied intelligence operations, prevented the Germans from committing their reserve forces where they were desperately needed. Hitler himself was sleeping late at the Berghof, his mountain retreat, and his staff were afraid to wake him with news of the invasion. When he finally learned of the landings, the Führer remained convinced that Normandy was a feint. He refused to release the 2 armored divisions held in reserve near Paris, a decision that would prove catastrophic for German hopes of throwing back the invasion. According to classified documents later released by the Central Intelligence Agency, German intelligence had been completely fooled by Operation Fortitude, the Allied deception campaign. By late afternoon, American forces had established a precarious foothold on the Norman coast. The price had been terrible, over 2,000 American casualties at Omaha Beach alone, but the Atlantic Wall had been breached. Engineers worked frantically to clear the beaches of obstacles while supplies and reinforcements poured ashore. The liberation of Western Europe had truly begun. Lieutenant Colonel Rudder's Rangers at Point du Hoc finally received reinforcement when elements of the 5th Ranger Battalion fought their way inland from Omaha Beach. The 2 units linked up, just as German counterattacks were intensifying, providing the embattled defenders with much-needed ammunition and medical supplies. Their sacrifice had not been in vain. The German guns remained silent. As darkness fell over Normandy on June 6, 1944, the Allies could claim success despite the enormous cost. Over 150,000 men had been landed on the beaches, establishing 5 separate beachheads that would soon be linked into a continuous front. The German defenders, despite their courage and skill, had been overwhelmed by the sheer scale and determination of the Allied assault. The battle for Normandy was far from over. Fierce fighting would continue for months as German forces attempted to contain and then eliminate the Allied beachhead. But the critical first day had been won through the sacrifice of thousands of soldiers who stormed the beaches knowing they might never return home. Their courage had cracked the foundation of Nazi-occupied Europe. The dawn of June 7, 1944, brought no respite for the exhausted Allied forces clinging to their Norman beachheads. German commanders, finally grasping the true scope of the invasion, began marshaling their reserves for a massive counterattack designed to drive the Allies back into the sea. The fate of the invasion hung in the balance as panzer divisions raced toward the coast, through bombed roads and strafed highways. General Sepp Dietrich's 1st Panzer Corps received orders to attack the British positions near Caen with the 12th Panzer Division and the elite 21st Panzer Division. These veteran units, equipped with Mark IV tanks and assault guns, represented Germany's best hope of crushing the invasion before it could be reinforced. Dietrich, a former Hitler bodyguard who had proven himself in Russia, understood that failure meant Germany's inevitable defeat. The 21st Panzer Division, commanded by Colonel Hermann von Oppeln-Bronichowski, had been closest to the invasion beaches when the assault began. However, conflicting orders and communication failures had prevented them from launching an immediate counterattack. Now, 24 hours later, they moved toward Sword Beach with grim determination, their tank crews knowing this might be their last chance to change the course of the war. British forces under General Bernard Montgomery faced this threat with characteristic resolve. The 6th Airborne Division, which had landed by parachute and glider before dawn on D-Day, held crucial bridges over the Caen Canal and River Orne. Major John Howard's glider-borne assault on Pegasus Bridge had been a complete success, denying the Germans a vital route for reinforcing their coastal defenses. The German attack began at noon with a thunderous artillery barrage that shook the Norman countryside. Nebelwerfer rocket launchers, called Screaming Mimes by Allied soldiers, added their terrifying voice to the bombardment. British positions disappeared in clouds of smoke and flying earth as German gunners attempted to soften up the defenses before the tank assault. Obergefreiter Hans Müller, a veteran tank commander whose Panzer IV had survived 2 years on the Eastern Front, led his platoon through the Norman hedgerows toward the British lines. The terrain was unlike anything they had faced in Russia. Small fields surrounded by ancient earthworks topped with thick hedges that channeled their advance into predictable routes. Every gap could hide an anti-tank gun. The British response was immediate and devastating. Royal Air Force Typhoon fighter bombers screamed down from the cloudy sky, their rockets tearing into the German armored columns. Squadron Leader Johnny Johnson led his aircraft in attack after attack, despite intense anti-aircraft fire from the German positions. The Luftwaffe, weakened by years of attrition, could provide little protection for the advancing tanks. Lieutenant Michael Wittmann, Germany's premier tank ace with over 100 confirmed kills, commanded a Tiger tank from the 501st Heavy Panzer Battalion. His massive 60-ton vehicle was nearly invulnerable to most Allied anti-tank weapons, and Wittmann had already demonstrated his lethal skill in numerous battles. Today, he would add to his legend in a brief but devastating engagement. Near the Ay village of Villers-Bocage, Wittmann encountered a British armored column from the 7th Armored Division. In a span of 15 minutes, his single Tiger tank destroyed 14 British tanks and 15 other armored vehicles, bringing an entire advance to a halt. The engagement demonstrated that individual skill and superior equipment could still influence battles despite overwhelming Allied numerical superiority. Historical analysis by the British Army's Staff College at Camberley confirms that Wittmann's action at Villers-Bocage was one of the most successful single-tank engagements of the entire war. However, German success was localized and temporary. Allied artillery, coordinated by forward observers and supported by naval gunfire from ships, offshore began to take a terrible toll on the attacking panzers. The battleship HMS Warspite, whose 15-inch guns had fought at Jutland in 1916, now provided devastating fire support that could destroy the heaviest German tanks with direct hits. Private James Mackenzie, now veteran of 2 days' combat, watched from his foxhole as German tanks approached his position near Omaha Beach. The sight of the massive Panzer IVs moving through the hedgerows was terrifying, but American tank destroyer crews were ready. The M10 Wolverine tank destroyers, with their powerful 3-inch guns, had been positioned in carefully camouflaged positions to ambush the German advance. The battle raged throughout the afternoon as German armor crashed against improvised Allied defenses. In many sectors, the outcome hung by a thread as panzer crews fought with the desperation of men who knew they were Germany's last hope. But the Allies had advantages that proved decisive: air superiority, naval gunfire support, and an unending stream of reinforcements arriving across the beaches. As evening approached, the German counterattack had clearly failed. Burning tanks dotted the Norman landscape, and surviving German units began withdrawing to more defensible positions. The opportunity to drive the Allies back into the sea had been lost forever, ensuring that the liberation of Western Europe would continue despite any obstacles the Wehrmacht might erect. The failure of the German counterattack marked a turning point in the Battle of Normandy. By June 10, 1944, Allied forces had successfully linked their separate beachheads into a continuous front stretching 50 miles along the Norman coast. The artificial harbors, codenamed Mulberry, began arriving in sections, promising to solve the critical problem of supplying the ever-growing Allied armies without capturing a major port. General Omar Bradley, commanding the 1st United States Army, established his headquarters in an apple orchard near the village of Saint-Laurent-sur-Mer. From this modest command post, he directed the expansion of the American sector while coordinating with British forces under General Montgomery. The soft-spoken Bradley, known to his men as the Soldier's General, faced the daunting task of breaking out from the confined beachhead into the French countryside. The German defense of Normandy now fell to Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, who had replaced the dismissed von Rundstedt. Kluge, nicknamed Clever Hans by his subordinates, understood that his forces were fighting a delaying action against overwhelming odds. Hitler's continued insistence that Normandy was a diversion prevented the commitment of reserves that might have made a difference in the battle's outcome. Private Mackenzie had been assigned to the 8th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division, which was preparing to attack the heavily fortified city of Saint-Vith. The young soldier from Minnesota had aged years in just 1 week of combat, learning hard lessons about survival that no training could have taught. His unit had suffered 50% casualties since D-Day, with replacement soldiers arriving daily to fill the depleted ranks. The Norman hedgerow country, called Bocage by the local population, proved to be a nightmare for Allied attackers and a blessing for German defenders. Centuries-old earthwork boundaries, topped with impenetrable hedges and often concealing German machine gun nests, turned every field into a potential battlefield. American infantry learned to fear these ancient barriers as much as any concrete bunker. Technical Sergeant Curtis Cullen of the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron developed an innovative solution to the hedgerow problem. Working with unit mechanics, he created steel cutting blades that could be welded to tank hulls, allowing armor to crash through hedgerows without exposing themselves to anti-tank fire. These Rhino tanks revolutionized Allied tactics in the Bocage country. The German 7th Army, commanded by Colonel General Friedrich Dollmann, fought a series of delaying actions designed to buy time for the construction of stronger defensive positions. Every village became a fortress, with German paratroopers and infantry using the bocage terrain to maximum advantage. The elite 3rd Parachute Division earned particular respect from Allied soldiers for their tenacious defense. British forces faced equally determined resistance as they attempted to capture the city of Caen, a key transportation hub that Montgomery had hoped to take on D-Day itself. The 12th Panzer Division, reinforced by elements of the Panzer Lehr Division, turned the medieval city into a fortress that would require weeks of bitter fighting to capture. The delay disrupted Allied plans for a rapid breakout from Normandy. Lieutenant Colonel William Darby, commanding the 6th Ranger Battalion, led his men in a daring night attack on German positions near the village of Cisterna. The Rangers moved silently through the darkness, using techniques perfected in training, camps across England. Their assault succeeded in capturing a key crossroads, but at a terrible cost. Darby himself was killed by German artillery fire just hours before the war in Europe would end. The supply situation gradually improved as engineers worked around the clock to expand beach facilities and construct the artificial harbors. By mid-June, over 500,000 Allied soldiers had been landed in Normandy, along with thousands of vehicles and tons of ammunition. The Great Storm of June 19th through 21st would temporarily disrupt operations, but could not stop the inexorable buildup of Allied strength. According to logistics records maintained by the United States Army Transportation Corps, the Normandy supply operation was the most complex military undertaking in American history. German resistance began to show signs of weakening as the Luftwaffe virtually disappeared from Norman skies and ammunition shortages affected front-line units. Many German soldiers, particularly those from occupied countries pressed into Wehrmacht service, began surrendering in increasing numbers. However, elite units like the Panzer divisions and paratroopers continued fighting with desperate skill. The city of Cherbourg, with its vital port facilities, became the focus of American attention in late June. The 29th Infantry Division, supported by the 4th and 79th Infantry Divisions, began a methodical advance up the Cotentin Peninsula. German engineers prepared to destroy the port facilities rather than let them fall intact into Allied hands, but the capture of Cherbourg would provide the Allies with a major logistical advantage. The breakout from the Norman beachhead was still weeks away, but the foundation had been laid for the eventual liberation of France and the march to Berlin. Every day brought fresh Allied reinforcements, while German reserves dwindled under the constant pounding of artillery and air attacks. The invasion that had begun so desperately on the beaches was now an unstoppable force grinding toward victory. By early July 1944, the Battle of Normandy had evolved from a desperate amphibious assault into a grinding war of attrition that would ultimately determine the fate of Nazi Germany. Allied forces, now numbering over 800,000 men, faced a German army that was increasingly outnumbered, but remained dangerously effective in defensive warfare. The stage was set for Operation Cobra, the breakout that would shatter German resistance and open the road to Paris. General George Smith Patton, Jr. arrived in Normandy to take command of the newly activated 3rd United States Army, bringing with him a reputation for aggressive armored warfare that struck fear into German hearts. Old Blood and Guts, as his men called him, chafed at the slow progress through the Bocage country and pressed his superiors for permission to unleash his tanks in a war of movement that would exploit American advantages in mobility and firepower. The German defense of Normandy was hampered by Hitler's continued interference in military operations. The Führer's insistence on holding every inch of ground prevented German commanders from conducting the flexible defense that might have prolonged the campaign. Field Marshal Rommel's wounding in an Allied strafing attack on July 17th removed the Wehrmacht's most capable defensive tactician from the battle. Lieutenant Colonel Mackenzie, promoted after his company commander was killed in action, led his battalion in the assault on Saint-Lô, a crucial transportation hub that controlled access to the interior of France. The city had been reduced to rubble by Allied bombing, earning it the grim nickname, Capital of the Ruins. German paratroopers defended every pile of rubble with characteristic tenacity, turning the urban warfare into a nightmare of close-quarters combat. The breakthrough came on July 25th when Operation Cobra commenced with the largest tactical, bombing mission of the war. Over 2,000 Allied bombers dropped their loads on German positions south of Saint-Lô, pulverizing the Panzer Lehr Division and opening a gap in the German lines. Unfortunately, some bombs fell short, causing casualties among American forces, including the death of Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, the highest-ranking American officer killed in the European theater. Private Billy Henderson of the 4th Armored Division watched in awe as American tank columns poured through the gap created by Operation Cobra. His Sherman tank, nicknamed Fury, was part of the spearhead that would soon be racing across France at speeds that stunned German defenders. The Bocage country that had constrained Allied movement for weeks gave way to open terrain perfect for armored warfare. The German collapse in Normandy accelerated rapidly as Allied forces exploited the breakthrough. The Falaise Pocket, where two entire German armies were trapped by converging Allied forces, became a killing ground of unprecedented proportions. General Heinz Guderian, the father of blitzkrieg tactics, watched helplessly as his armored reserves were systematically destroyed by Allied air power and artillery. Canadian forces under General Henry Crerar played a crucial role in closing the Falaise Pocket, advancing from the north while American forces attacked from the south. The 1st Polish Armored Division, fighting to liberate their homeland, seized the key town of Chambois and held it against desperate German counterattacks. The courage of these Polish soldiers, many of whom had escaped their occupied homeland years earlier, symbolized the international nature of the crusade against fascism. The liberation of Paris on August 25, 1944, marked the symbolic end of the Normandy campaign. General Charles de Gaulle, leader of the Free French, insisted that French forces lead the entry into the capital city. The 2nd French Armored Division, commanded by General Philippe Leclerc, had the honor of accepting the German surrender of the City of Light. Military historians from the École Militaire in Paris have documented that over 200,000 German soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured during the Battle of Normandy. The cost of victory had been enormous. Allied casualties in Normandy exceeded 200,000, while German losses approached 400,000. Entire divisions on both sides had been destroyed and rebuilt multiple times during the 11-week campaign. The Norman countryside bore scars that would remain visible for decades: destroyed villages, abandoned equipment, and countless graves of young men who would never return home. Field Marshal Walter Model, who had replaced von Kluge as commander of German forces in the west, attempted to establish a new defensive line along the Seine River. However, the Wehrmacht lacked the resources to halt the Allied advance. The destruction of Army Group B in Normandy had eliminated Germany's strategic reserve in Western Europe, making the eventual Allied victory inevitable. The Battle of Normandy represented more than a military victory. It marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany and the liberation of occupied Europe. The soldiers who had stormed the beaches on June 6th, many of them teenagers who had never seen combat, had grown into hardened veterans capable of defeating the world's most professional army. Their sacrifice had opened the second front that Stalin had demanded and Hitler had feared. As autumn approached and Allied armies raced toward the German border, the significance of the Normandy landings became clear. Operation Overlord had not only succeeded in its immediate objectives, but had fundamentally altered the strategic balance of World War II. The Atlantic Wall, once considered impregnable, lay in ruins, and with it, the Nazi dream of a 1,000-year Reich. The liberation of Western Europe had begun on the bloody beaches of Normandy and would not end until Allied forces stood in the ruins of Berlin.